Aloha mai kako. Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining us, for making time in your day to be part of our presentation this afternoon. All of us that are a part of this committee and have been working towards planning our time together, uh, we'll all get a chance to speak. And I guess we'll just introduce ourselves as we go and as we share our different parts of our presentation this afternoon. Uh, Let me start with myself. Wao o kahu manu nai ole, he kahua ma ka halepule o kalihia mo ana lua, a me ke kula o Kamehameha ma kapala ma. I am kahu manu nai ole. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the kahu both at Kalihia Moana Lua Church as well as at Kamehameha Schools here on Oahu. For those of you who read our title, so the title of our presentation today is Mission Focused Measures, Developing New Metrics for a New Church. And that can be scary because change is scary for all of us, right? Whenever we make change, to me, there are usually two people. There are the ones that don't want to change and the ones that are like, finally doing something, getting going, right? But there are those of us that have fears, and we kind of span that whole spectrum of emotions. Some of us are looking forward to change. Some of us are apprehensive and fearful about the change that might be coming. Change does weird things to people who are already weird. I mean, we are already weird people. And anytime somebody brings in change, it just makes us more weird. But one of the things we recognize within the life of our church, and many of you can probably see this as you look around your church, is that it's not so much that the church is broken, but the church could use some repair and we could use some renovation. In a 2011 Barna research study where they studied young adults in their 20s, they found that 59% of young adults leave the Christian faith in their 20s. Some do eventually return, but some do not return. And then in a more recent follow-up that they did in 2019, they found that there was actually an upward tick in this same population that went up to 64% of our young people leaving church and leaving their faith, in some cases completely. And so we've been wrestling a lot with how do we combat this, this drastic downturn in the life of our church, and what are some things we can do to measure our success. For me, for those of you that watched, some of you may be thinking, hey, I know that guy from somewhere. I did the devotion on Monday. And if you were on the devotion, right, the scripture text that I use, because for me, it's where I kind of ground my mission work and my church work is in Matthew 28, when Jesus calls us to go and make disciples. And that discipleship process, it's something that we all are trying to get a hand of. How do we measure our discipleship process? At one point in time in the life of the church, the discipleship process was simply conversion. How many people are you converting? How many people now say they follow Jesus because of the work that you are doing? And at one point in time, that was a good measure. But the reality is, when you read the church, right, the disciples were called early in Jesus' ministry to follow Jesus. But near the end, we find that, a quarter of Jesus's 12 closest people betrayed him, they denied him, they doubted him, right? And there are these things that were going on, but they were still in that discipleship process, because eventually they come out of it and they start to form the early church and they start to do some good work. But maybe in that case, conversion, right? How do you measure their conversion? Because they said, I'll follow you, Jesus. But then they weren't following Jesus, and then they decided to come back and follow Jesus. And so maybe there's a need for us to think about new ways that we measure our discipleship process, and for us to think about our discipleship process. I've been reading through this book called Simple Church. Sorry, I looked up just to make sure I got the book title correct. But it talks in there about the need for clarity and the need for understanding exactly what you're doing and the ways that you measure people through the process. And it's not really a measurement of conversion, but it's measuring people through the process. One of the things that you'll hear from our other presenters is some different ways and some different potential ways that we can think about how we measure our discipleship process rather than how we measure the end result of discipleship in some cases. I've been reflecting a lot, and I think it really fits. And this is where I'm going to end kind of my point of sharing and way of introduction. But I've been coming back a lot through the book of Habakkuk, and mostly because I've been doing a lot of work just here at Commitment Schools on kind of crafting a mission and a vision statement for us. But in Habakkuk, when you read it in chapter 1, Habakkuk goes to God and he says, God, there are all these problems that are wrong with Israel, and you're not listening to me. I'm complaining to you because there's iniquity, there's wickedness, there's destruction, there's violence. God, why don't you fix it? Right? And God responds to him, and God says, okay, I'll fix it. I'll fix it in a way where the Bible says you would not believe if you were told how I plan to fix it. And what God says is God decides, because in Habakkuk's mind, what he wants God to do is just change the people of Israel, right? But God says, I'm going to use the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to change the people of Israel. And for Habakkuk, he's like, what? That's crazy. Like, they're worse than Israel, the people that I'm complaining about. Why are you going to use worse people to fix us? Right? And sometimes, as I think about Habakkuk, sometimes the solutions that God has for us, they're out of the realm of our possibility and out of the realm of our current framework. And so today, it's not an opportunity for us to sit here and to say we know all the answers, right? A lot of the problems that you see reflected in your church are happening at our churches as well. And so we're not here to say that these are the only solutions, but what we are here to say is the same way that God responded to Habakkuk, to be open to just the amazing ways that I'm going to work, that we ask that you come, just inviting and welcoming God to speak his truth and to speak the way that he speaks, but for us to be open and receptive to the ways that God may be asking the weird people we already are to be even more weird as we go through these changes. So thank you for joining us and for being a part of our presentation. I will hand it over to
me.
Yeah.
Aloha, kako. My name is Ben Sheets. I'm the pastor at Lanai Union Church over on the island of Lanai. I've been there just over a year now. Prior to that, I served 13 years in a good-sized congregation in central Wisconsin. I'm a Lutheran pastor, ELCA Lutheran. I served my first 8 years as the associate pastor there. And then when the senior pastor retired, I was called to be their senior pastor, was there for about 5 years. And now I'm on this new adventure. And so I'm eager to share some of the learnings that I've gained along the way and some of the things that inspire and provoke me as I think about ministry and how we go about it, especially in light of all those things that Manu shared with us, the changes that we're all facing. So I'm going to start my presentation time by giving you all a test.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
I absolutely love this video. I've been showing this video for many, many years. It's a great ad campaign for cyclists, keeping your eye out on the road. But I also think it's a great word for us in the church, that it's easy to not see things you're not looking for. The prophet Isaiah declares the word of the Lord saying, I am about to do a new thing. Do you not perceive it? It now springs forth. And I come in the firm conviction that God is moving among us. God is a moonwalking bear, moving in our churches and in our ministries. And what I hope that you take away from our time today is that is the ways that we can begin to perceive. I don't know that there's that we're not going to give you like the answer and the way to do it, but we're going to give you ways to begin to listen to Scripture, to one another, and to the world. And as we do that, we will see what God is up to. I'm confident of that. It's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be comfortable. It's going to push us and it's going to provoke us. But it's certainly, I think, the work that we as the church are called to do in these days. The resource I want to share with you, and what has inspired a lot of my part of the presentation, is this book called Faithful Metrics by Peggy Hahn. She's the executive director of LEAD, Living Every Day as Disciples, an organization out of Texas that works with churches and leaders in thinking about these things. You can see their information there on the screen. So basically, Peggy, the point of this book and the point of this resource, is the point of this workshop is to begin to see where might God be moving among us in places that we haven't been looking. In my experience, Manu alluded to this as well, that we have two metrics in the church that people are really concerned about at the annual meeting at the end of the year. It's how many people were in the pews and how much money did we get in the offering plate. And those become the places of evaluation for how successful our ministry has been. And yet we are in a culture and in a world where we see those things on the decline. And most churches, now post-pandemic, or not post-pandemic, but here at this point in the pandemic, are seeing attendance rates at 75% at most of what it was pre-pandemic. And so we're seeing this across the board. And so does this mean that it's a sign of a failing church? Or perhaps there are other things that we could be measuring to see what God is up to. And the way I think we want to go about that is not just looking at those metrics, those things that we look at the end of the year. What was our budget? Did we make our budget? Did our average weekly worship attendance, was it higher or lower than it was last year? Because once those things have happened, at the end of the year, we can't go back and change it. Those are called lag metrics because they happen at the end of something. And often we'll set out a goal at the beginning of the year. We want to increase giving, we want to increase worship attendance, but then we don't do anything really intentional about it. And we expect transformation to happen. So what this process is about looking at who you are, finding those things that we're deeply value, creating our goals out of that, and then creating metrics that happen along the way that we can check in with time and time again throughout the year. And then once we've seen how those goals have or have not been accomplished, we can go back and reevaluate what our goals actually should be and how we can go back and look at our values. For example, in my previous call, we had a robust confirmation ministry. We would have 30 to 40 kids every week coming to confirmation from 7th grade through 9th grade. 25 weeks a year, half the year. And it was really, I think, successful. But what we would see is that the only time we really had a goal or a metric was when we had them at the end write a paper, their faith statement. And we were never really on an individual basis checking in with them about how things were going, what they were learning, to see if what we were actually teaching them, if they were actually catching on to that. And so we started to redevelop our entire confirmation ministry so that we could check in and with small little nuggets of getting feedback about different events or activities, and just asking students to respond with 1 or 2 sentences about how they saw their faith active in that moment or in that activity, or what they drew away from an event, so that we could check in, that we not just to evaluate them, but to evaluate ourselves, to evaluate our own ministry and help grow it and shape it over the course of years. Now, this is not always easy because people like the way it was. And they like to say, well, we don't have to write anything, we don't have to do anything until the end. And so there was that pushback, there was some conflict. We had to kind of really work with people. And that process continued on after I left. But that was kind of the thought. It's like, we value this ministry. We know it's important, that forming faith in young people is super important at that age. How can we be checking in on that throughout this entire ministry, and not just waiting until 9th grade confirmation ceremony, and then we say, okay, you're all confirmed, but never really seeing whether they grew in their faith, if their ministry made any impact or not. So that was one way that we took a ministry that was valued, that we knew that we valued because we named it as leaders. We set a goal and then began to attempt to evaluate it. I think we needed to go back and constantly work on that, constantly change on what those metrics look like, and share that vision and why we're doing what we're doing with the people who it impacts, so that they knew, why are these changes happening? What is the point of this? So that they could be on board as well. So you're always going back. Your vision impacts your goals. Your goals are measured by your metrics, and those metrics you need to learn then. Do we actually value this? What actually is our value? What it actually should be our goals, and what we're doing effective and making it impact. So a little bit about, and that's this book, Faithful Metrics, helps congregations think about these things and walk through that process, and helping leaders begin to have this conversation. And I found it a really helpful resource, and I would commend it to you. I'm going to pass it on now to Heather, who can share another resource that might be available.
Aloha, everybody. I'm Heather Barfield. I am the associate pastor at United Church of Christ, Judd Street here in Honolulu, where I've been here for 3 years. And I was asked to speak to you about a program called New Beginnings. It is actually through the Disciples of Christ Church, but I know plenty of UCC churches who have used it. There are plenty of churches in our own conference who have been through New Beginnings process, including United Church of Christ, Judd Street. And so I just want to kind of let you know that I was ordained disciple, so that's kind of why I'm familiar with it. I have served congregations that have used New Beginnings, most of them not successfully, if I'm being perfectly honest. I hold a certificate in spiritual entrepreneurship, which is big terminology there, but it just means I really like to think outside the box. So anytime I get the chance to do so, I kind of try to take advantage of that. New Beginnings is one of those programs that allows churches to do just that, but it takes it a step beyond a book. There is a book aspect to it, but it also allows people to have a coach, if you will, a support system, somebody who will walk side by side with you. So if we go to the next screen, Ben, we will see the process here. So I want to kind of speak a little bit about that right now. And so step one is the preparation. It's almost like you're going through the search and call process, if you will. Looking for a new pastor, you have to submit all this information. Well, it's no different when you're going through the New Beginnings process. You submit a bunch of information that they ask for. A lot of it includes information on church membership, financial reports, property, like the square footage, and just different aspects of what makes you you. And then in that process, and number two, phase two is the assessment visit. So you will have somebody from the organization come to your church and get to know you, get to know your congregation, get to know your setting. And so part of what that entails is meeting with different groups of people, the pastor, the board, any leadership teams, but they also spend time in your neighborhood, in your surrounding area. A lot of times this will entail a pastor or maybe the church moderator going on a ride through the neighborhood, pointing out different things to this person. Number three, phase 3 is the assessment report. So once the person has been here and visited, then they will take all that information back with them and they compile it. And so what they hand you is a nice booklet of information that can actually somewhat seem overwhelming at times, but as you work your way through it, it includes a lot of demographic work. And a lot of times that's information that we don't necessarily have the time to work on ourselves. So it's good information to have. And so they'll lay that all out in paper for you. And then phase 4 gets into house meetings. In some of the churches I've been in, we focused on books. We focus on looking through the material in particular in collaboration with another book, but they are very specified. You like to have small group meetings in someone's home, not at the church. They actually ask you not to meet at the church. And they also ask any pastors, a clergy, not to be part of the house meetings. They don't want the pastors to influence the people and likewise, right? So you'll have house meetings for a couple months probably. And then you get to the discernment and coaching stage. And this is just where you kind of have to take all this information that you've gathered in a couple months time and kind of figure out what to do next. Where's God calling us? How are we going to measure success? Do we, are we going to close our doors? Is that what this is going to lead us to? So there's various reasons why congregations would reach out. The ones that I have personally served have been in a place of severe discernment and shrinking membership and trying to decide, do they sell their property? Do they continue on? I will say all of them have continued on. And then, phase 6 is the decision. What's next, right? So, and implementing that information, so your decision. They'll give you a couple of scenarios. They're pretty standard scenarios, honestly. But I will say for United Church of Christ, Judd Street, of course, I've been there 3 years. 2 of those years have been in pandemic mode. But it is the one congregation that I have served at that continues to bring up New Beginnings terminology. So we are just getting back into the worshiping process and looking at ways to move forward. We have to really kind of look at things and assess things all the time. So just like Ben was talking about, you have to go back and look at your vision, your mission, and reassess things all the time. It's no different with New Beginnings. And so at Judd Street, we're always looking at new beginning opportunities. So that's kind of where we're at. I will say it does cost money. And for some people, they think it's too expensive, but you have to kind of do the pros and cons there and see if it's right for you. And as they like to say on their website, if you visit their website, 99% of all congregations decide on a future path. So of those churches, they share that 60% choose some form of mission revisioning, which is great. 35% choose to redevelop the church, also great. 5% choose to close, providing their assets for creating new ministry. And that in and of itself, while painful and a tough decision to make, can also be a very great decision in helping the church move forward into their future and really live into the vision and mission that Christ calls us to be the church. And so a lot of times what happens is those monies will then go help other ministries. So that's what I wanted to share with you on New Beginnings. Again, like I said, there are several congregations in our conference who have gone through the New Beginnings process. I myself have been through it. So if you have any questions, I will put my information in the chat box when I'm done speaking for you. You can always feel free to reach out to me. That would be fine. Thank you.
Aloha, everybody. So I'm Josh Hayashi, and I currently serve as one of the chaplains at Punahou School, but on the side, I work to help churches here in our state and in just try and figure out what is God telling them. And I realize as I'm hearing our two colleagues or three colleagues or four colleagues in the rest of this, really asking these questions of what is success for a church or for our churches, and what does it mean for us to really get a handle on what's happening. And I would probably say that for so many of these situations that we're in, or that COVID I think has even accelerated, and post-COVID, as what Ben shared, has even accelerated some of the trends that we've been seeing. And I don't know about you folks, but I'm seeing it all over. And so the need now is for us to discern some very difficult and important trends. And I think so that question of success, whether it's by different metrics or by like a process like New Beginnings, is really an important one. I also think, though, that over the next 10 years, just to be really honest, I think success is going to be survival. And many of our churches will probably not survive. And that's not for a lack of faith, that's not for a lack of effort, that's not for a lack of, of desire, but it really is decisions that we can make now about that. And so things are really challenging. And this is not so much to what I do is a little bit different. And it's not so much to give you facts or an assessment on how to figure out what's best. What I try to help you do is to think about what is the legacy that your church will leave over the next 25 years. Because most of us will not be here 25 years from now. That means that we have to start thinking a little bit differently. And just some of the some of the trends that we're seeing just in our conference, as far as people who grew up here in Hawaii who are ordained and are under the age of 60 serving in the Hawaii Conference, there are 4 of us. There's nobody in seminary right now that's headed towards parish ministry. That is from Hawaii Conference, that is in the seminary, all members in discernment. Church attendance is changing, church membership is changing. The state of our properties are changing. And this is not just us here in Hawaii, but it's across our country. And I think the hardest part, though, is that it's an emotional one. It's grieving that we're not going to go back to what it was in the 60s and the 70s or the 90s or the 80s. And so it's a matter now of us making some tough choices about what happens next. Now, I think I can echo what the rest of my colleagues said, is that, a couple of things. One, there's good news, is that we have been in this situation before. Every 500 years, God does something significantly different with the church. This is like a painting of Martin Luther here. And so, 500 years ago was the Reformation. 501 years ago, or 2 years ago, was the Reformation. And 500 years before that, it was Charlemagne, and 500 years before that was a great East-West Schism. And so we've been here before. And so now it's a matter of us listening to God and figuring out what happens next. Now, what I deal with specifically is something maybe unique and separate. For many of us, our fixed costs, like our church building, like insurance, like the salary of our pastor or other support staff, those are the things that are putting the biggest strain on us, insurance, etc. And so while we don't know, no one can say what the future of the church is going to be like specifically. What we can say for sure is that if we don't deal with the stuff, that will kind of crush the ability for anything else to move forward, right? if we don't deal with like our property, if we don't figure out what to do with that, if we don't figure out how to pay for insurance, if we don't figure out some of these things, that's kind of a challenge for us. That's our big challenge, especially in a place like Hawaii, where you know, land is a very unique and a special thing, and we view it differently than anything than a lot of other places. And so when we talk specifically about church land, you know, what does that mean? So I work specifically, and there are some other people like me across the country that are doing this kind of work, is to help churches come up with a process to figure out what to do with their properties. And most of the times that will involve partnerships that could involve like funding partners, that could involve development partners, that could involve rental partners. It's a way of utilizing your property to turn it from something that sucks money away from the mission and the legacy into something that funnels money back into that. And so I think that's really, really important and complicated, but it in some ways it may seem separate from the mission. But I think what I'm excited about is that this kind of work of sharing our space, whether it's in housing or preschool, or there's various other things that are possible, it really does two things. One, it reestablishes our position as the center of the neighborhood. Number two, it really shows the church's generosity and willingness to engage as a civic partner in the neighborhood. And I think we haven't really had that in a long time. And the third thing, though, is that it reinvigorates our mission. You know, we do have some property and assets, and that is such a valuable thing in Hawaii. And for us to be able to share that and to share it in the name of Jesus Christ, to share it with trusted partners, that is one way for our legacy to move forward and for us to survive, to see what God does next. And so, you know, these are just various things of us to think about. What is God calling us to do, whether it's new beginnings or the original thing that Ben shared? You know, what is God calling us to do, and how do we discern what to do with what we have? I kind of liken myself to like a physical trainer, right? Like you have the doctor that tells you gotta lose weight, or the doctor that tells you gotta start exercising, or whatever that is. But it's when you actually get up in the morning and go to the trainer, and they start lifting weights with you, or start helping you with the diet. And I think in a lot of ways, that's our challenge with our properties right now, is that they have been an incredible gift and they are an incredible legacy. But we have to start thinking about, or it would be helpful if we could start thinking about them differently and be able to utilize them in a way that could bring the biggest benefit to our mission and to our neighborhood. So I work with churches specifically in that area. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much for what you shared with us. We are about to go into a breakout session, and you will be presented with a scenario in a few moments to discuss amongst yourself, and then we'll come back to the large group.
Adapted from The Growing Church, a case study in leadership for change by Courtney B. Davis Olds. 30 years ago, Fairview Denominational Church was largely what one would expect from an established Euro-American church in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area. Worship services were restrained and formal, with hymns and an organ. The congregation was sizable, with mostly middle to upper middle class members attired in their best clothes. Theologically, the church tended toward the conservative side of the spectrum. And, like most all churches, Fairview Denominational Church was not immune to the decline brought about by the shifting religious landscape in the United States. Today, Fairview Denominational Church has transformed into the Growing Church, and it is largely unlike what one would expect given its history and origins. Worship services are loud and unrestrained, with a house band and a variety of songs. The congregation is smaller, with some ethnic diversity and members from a wide socioeconomic spectrum. No one dresses in anything more formal than jeans on Sunday mornings. Theologically, the church is thoroughly evangelical and LGBT affirming. It also has a strong environmental focus that is reflected in its new rural location. And, unlike many churches, the Growing Church is thriving. The Reverend Dr. Robin Matthews, age 56, has been senior pastor of what is now the Growing Church for 26 years. She arrived at Fairview Denominational Church as a seminary intern more than 30 years ago. The first seed that would become the growing church was planted as a strategic response to a growing dissatisfaction among congregants. The board structure of the church was no longer serving the needs of ministry and was hindering the discipleship of members. So in her first year as senior pastor, she proposed a new structure that would be more efficient and effective. A single board divided into elders with responsibility for overall guidance and leadership, and deacons with responsibility for the church's physical property and assets. The second seed was a theological shift. While serving as senior pastor, Matthews started a Sunday evening worship service for the LGBT community at a separate site. This began as an independent ministry from the church. After several years of ministry and study, the two congregations were merged and became one. Some people were not happy with this decision and left. At the same time, the church gained new members who were attracted by the welcome extended to the LGBT community. When Fairview later held a congregational vote on becoming a recognized welcoming and affirming congregation, the motion was unanimously approved. The next significant seed was related to the practice of worship. In the course of becoming a welcoming and affirming congregation, FDC experienced the exodus of many longtime stalwart members and an influx of new members, many of whom were younger than the emigres and less steeped in traditional church culture. The hymns, organ music, formal attire, and restrained worship, for which Fairview was known, did not appeal to the newer members, nor did they appeal to many of the younger members who had spent their lives at the church. Eventually, hymns were eliminated, contemporary worship songs were added, and the musicians in the congregation formed a band. As a result, worship services became more informal, less traditional, and noticeably louder. This shift, according to Matthews, was even more difficult than the journey to becoming a welcoming and affirming congregation, in part because those who were adamantly opposed to the new worship style did not immediately leave the church as former disaffected members had. Rather, they remained at FDC, making their dissatisfaction known and polarizing the congregation over more than just the music. Eventually, some of these members left FDC, while others came around to the louder, less formal contemporary worship style. Through attrition, schism, and change-induced exodus, the membership of Fairview Denominational Church in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a mere fraction of the 350 people who were on the membership list when Matthews first arrived at the church in the mid-1980s. Yet, in spite of its tumultuous history, FDC was remarkably healthy. However, in spite of its vitality, the attrition of membership led to financial hardship as the new congregation struggled to maintain a large facility. The congregation eventually sold their existing site, moved into a new site appropriate for their ministry, and now worships as a vibrant community of faith newly named the Growing Church.
All right, welcome back to the large group, everyone. Of course, as always, in these sorts of settings, we did not have enough time to really get into that case scenario. There was a lot there that we could have pulled out in terms of that particular case scenario, and then relating it to other scenarios that we've personally experienced or corporately experienced. But that's just the nature of Zoom. And so going forward in the future, I can say that āina will have other online gatherings that will perhaps afford us more time. But for today, this is where we are. And so I'm going to ask that groups begin reporting out. Let's start with group number 1 and then work our way through. Lori, we had a total of 5 groups, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. So let's start with group 1. What did you all come up with?
So we forgot to choose a speaker to share out. So I'll just share out for our group.
Okay.
So 2 of the things that we had talked about, and maybe in some ways that we can change things. One was being more mobile as a church. Bob had shared how at a previous church that he was at in North Carolina, the pastor had challenged them to go out and to see what's going on at other churches and how that can inform the way that they do ministry in their church. And then we also had mentioned, and then that grew into a conversation about partnerships and the ways we partner with others and looking beyond just the UCC churches but looking at our neighborhood and the people that are serving in our neighborhoods, and how we can be better churches in our neighborhood by partnering with people who are doing the same kind of good work that God has called us to do.
Group 2, are you ready? Do we need to move to group 3 and come back to you?
We don't know our group number.
Okay, well, since you're there, go right ahead. Don't worry about it. You go ahead, Kenneth.
What? That's what I get for talking. Well, in our group, it began with a comment that the metrics whereby we count heads and finance are so superficial and has nothing to do with ministry. And so part of the conversation blended into whenever someone or anyone comes into a leadership position, your very first job is to look for your replacement. And as you find your replacement or replacements and you pass the baton, you always have to remember to let the baton go. And I think we have failed in looking for those next generation until we're pretty almost dead. And then we look behind and going, who's there? So the perspective that we're looking at is how do we create relational? And so it's creating those small home churches or little Bible, it doesn't have to be Bible study groups, but just little home churches for relational pieces, between 2 to 5 to 8 people max. And they care for each other. And so the idea is how to nurture a relational part that can expand. And then the last thing is, if we want youth, then we need to put the youth into a leadership position and help them to grow, rather than string them along with a carrot, but we pull the ropes. And so that's, I think, if the rest of our group agrees, that's what we basically talked about.
Very good points. Thank you so much. Next group.
Yeah, so I was in that group and I got appointed to speak and to take notes. But we talked about the challenge of, and especially in light of this case study, like how do you measure success when a large portion of the original congregation was disenfranchised? And so we talked about the need for how do you create connections, and how do people who are new to our congregations, how are they connecting and making deep and important relationships to those who have been around for generations, and that could be something, in fact, that's measured, so that metrics aren't just numbers, but also like how are we doing on making connections to building an actual koinonia, an actual community, and recognizing that there are really, in some of our congregations, there are challenges with that because there are huge culture differences. My congregation that I serve, I'm a white man, but I serve in a Kosraean, primarily a Kosraean community congregation. And so there's cultural values and things that are different. Some congregations, one person shared that she's in a Chinese congregation, and there's kind of the Chinese community that's been there for a while and a newer Chinese community, and that both Chinese, but come at things differently. And so that really makes things challenging, and that certainly change is hard, but really focused on the relational need of our congregations that underpins a lot of these conversations.
Thank you. Next group, please.
Well, we ended with the observation toward the end of the case study. There's a statement: yet in spite of its tumultuous history, FDC was remarkably healthy. The question was, in what way? And the other point I might share from our discussion, which was largely my recounting what Makiki Christian Church has been doing these last 6 or 7 years, because we have been trying to address this issue, but it's a difficult conversation to have with church people who have never before had to engage with their church membership, their belonging to a church in this way, and even more face the kinds of radical decisions that the present occasion calls for. So it's and I guess the simplest way to leave that is to encourage all of our congregations to have as many honest discussions as we can manage to have, because it starts with those conversations. And I bet a lot of you would recognize how difficult even those first conversations can be. So yeah, but we, some of us have been trying to address this in our congregations for years.
Thank you, Wayne. I think we have 2 more groups yet left. Go ahead, please. We want to hear from you as well.
I think that we really kind of lingered on the places of loss question as we were discussing this, and the question kind of came up, or like the way I would phrase it at least, like at what point is what happened here any different than a church deciding to shut down and a new church plant starting up? That, if the changes are this radical, is this functionally, I mean, the fact that the pastor stayed on, is that the only thing that makes it the same church? It's easier to, it's easier to understand like the transition between, old worship and contemporary worship, and moving into an LGBTQ plus affirming kind of congregation. But when we're talking about that context here in Hawaii, you're talking about, say, like a historically Hawaiian church not speaking Hawaiian anymore, not singing Hawaiian hymns, putting those things away for contemporary worship, that's casual and whatnot. Like at a certain point, would that historically Hawaiian church still be a historically Hawaiian church? Or would it be something else? And just kind of like the difficulties of what, where the continuity actually is, or isn't. Who knows? We didn't figure it out, at least.
Okay, thank you so much. Actually, you were our last group, so we're a little bit over time, but Lori is being gracious to us. This has been a very engaging conversation, and again, āina will come back to the conference in the future with other ways that we can share together around these very important issues. So everyone else introduced themselves. I think most of you know who I am, but in case you don't, my name is Valerie Ross, and I'm one of the associate conference ministers. I happen to be the one that is on Kauai Island. So what do I have to say about all that we've heard today? And we've heard a lot, and we have a lot to reflect upon. In terms of what the mission is, if you will, or vision. I like to put vision before mission, because mission really comes out of the vision. I refer us back to something that Josh kind of referred to earlier, and that is our conference minister, David's article from The Friend, way before I arrived in Hawaii. He did an article in The Friend around innovation and engagement in February of 2021. And he talked about some of those very things that Josh mentioned, that how in particular, every 500 years, there is like a cataclysmic change within the church, within Christendom. When I say the church here, please understand, I'm not necessarily talking about the UCC, although that's who we are, but just across the board in Christendom. And so I invite you all, if you haven't read it already, or even if you did back in 2021, go back to The Friend and look at that article that our conference minister wrote. It's very insightful and really speaks to the vision that he had for this missional team way before I even thought about coming to Hawaii. I'm very pleased to be the one who's doing this work. Pleased to be working alongside the team members that we have on innovation and engagement. But I would just say that in this quasi post-pandemic environment, the church, again, we have experienced so much change already. And even if COVID were not a part of our reality, the church had still experienced much change and would have still continued to experience much change. When we add the factor of COVID in, that takes on a whole nother thing that we've all had to live through. So what we really want to do is see the church that we want to have in the future. That's what innovation and engagement is all about. And this is just one of several ways we presented you with today to do the kind of work that needs to be done in order to see not only your local congregations change, but to see the entire conference change. We want to help you understand what you have as assets as opposed to what you have as hindrances. That's another thing that āina is working towards doing. I really like the fact that Mano brought in statistics, and another statistic I came up with is that 87% of people that use a church or a mosque or a synagogue, but in the context of our conversation, a church, during the week do not worship there on Saturday or Sunday. So what does that say? That we might want to look at adaptive reuse of our spaces. Again, that goes back to the work that Josh does here in Hawaii. I've done that kind of work back on the mainland with a couple of groups that I'm involved with helping churches try to figure out readaptive uses for their space. Well, that can happen here in Hawaii too. And we're really blessed to have Josh and his expertise around adaptive reuse and what you might be able to do with a space where you are only worshiping on Sunday. What else might that space be used for during the week? How else might you bring in the community? They may not become members of your congregation right away, but if that space can be used to gather people and to embrace the community, then that might be something we want to think about. And so we're here, āina is here to help you think through and work through those things. I love what Heather brought up about the entity that she has worked with. That's one idea. And then of course, right here in the UCC, we have the Cornerstone Fund, we have the Church Building and Loan Fund, which also does that kind of work. A couple of churches have here in the conference have worked with the Church Building and Loan Fund in the past. And so those are resources that we have right there at our fingertips here in the UCC. Consultation, pre-development, looking at hybridity, looking at real space or real place and real space, space assessment of where you are and what you have to do. If any of you were able to listen in on Andy Bunn's presentation yesterday about what the foundation is doing with regard to the property, the assets that we have, he talked about that a little bit and how mission properties that we have, active places of worship, he said, must remain sustainable. And so this is a question of viability from the perspective of the Hawaii Conference Foundation. So all of these conversations we've been having this week, which is a wonderful thing. And for me, which is how the Holy Spirit works. There have been no random conversations this week. I've attended all these workshops and there are linkages across the board. And so the Holy Spirit, I believe in my heart, is speaking to the Hawaii Conference about how we might go about moving forward and being what it is God has called us to be. It is daunting, as our conference minister has said, to watch the religious change before our eyes. However, congregations have become more adaptable, and innovation and engagement, we look forward to working with the congregation in this conference around how you might become more adaptable and how you might use these metrics to take your ministry to the place where God is leading you to take it. And so with that, we're over time now. We're at 1:39. We were supposed to end at 1:30, but I really enjoyed this. I hope that you will reach out to us, us being the members of the innovation and engagement team, with questions And hopefully we will get the opportunity to work with you all. If you have ongoing projects already, we'd love to hear about that and maybe give you ideas and suggestions on how you might be able to move that project further. And if you're just starting out, if you don't even have a vision yet, if you're not sure what you want to do, still, that's no reason not to reach out to the team and see if we are able to help you in any way, shape, or form. So I thank you very much for joining us today. This is the rollout of the innovation and engagement team. To all my colleagues, thank you so much for your participation and for taking the time to do this. To our conference minister, thank you so much for finding it not robbery to give me this assignment. I'm grateful for it, and I will do the very best that I can with the help of the Lord and the Holy Spirit. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Lori and Christian, always appreciate your expertise. Thank you both as well. God bless.